morning. Welcome everybody to the second in this season's School of Management book series. My name's Steve Brammer. I'm Dean of the School of Management these last 18 months or so, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's event. The book series is a series of events in which we celebrate and explore recent books written by members of our School of Management community. The events give us an opportunity to hear from leading experts about their books and provide our audiences with an opportunity to pose questions and engage directly with those books' authors. So I'm delighted that you're all here this morning. I wish for a really fantastic event. It's great to see such a large and diverse group assembling on a Monday morning for a conversation about operations and process management. Today, I'm delighted to welcome a wonderful colleague, Professor Alistair Brandon-Jones, who will be known to many of you, to talk about his book, Operations and Process Management. Before we get stuck into the detail of today's event, a couple of housekeeping issues. We're very keen that participants take the opportunity to engage directly with Alistair, to pose questions. As Rachel has put in the chat, the Q&A function is there for you to be able to encourage you to do that. Our experience is that after Alistair and I have spent 30 or 40 minutes talking about his book, colleagues will at that point begin to think about their questions. And I'd be grateful if, as we're having our conversation, colleagues would think about their questions and pose them in the Q&A. Otherwise, what will happen is we'll have 15 questions with 15 seconds to go, and we won't have time to actually answer those questions. So given that engagement with the community is a key part of what we're trying to do here, do get your questions in early as you feel inspired by the conversation that we are about to have. Colleagues can also vote for questions in the Q&A function. So if somebody else has asked a question that you would particularly like to hear Alistair's thoughts on, then do click on the thumbs up and that will rise up the list. So let me just take a minute to introduce Alistair to today's audience. As well as being all-round fantastic guy who will be known to many of you, I'm sure, Professor Alistair Brandon-Jones is Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management in our School of Management here in the University of Bath. His research focuses on digitalisation of operations and supply chain, with particular foci on professional service operations and on healthcare operations. Alistair is, I'm very grateful to say, head of our Information Decision and Operations Division, and also a former Associate Dean for Post-Experience Education. I think that speaks to his skills and his aptitudes, not only in research, but his passion for education. I won't embarrass him by reading the long list of teaching awards that I know he's won down the years in various places out. Today, Alistair and I talk about operations and process management, the 6th edition of which has just hit the shelves of every great bookstore and digital provider. Welcome, Alistair. Al, perhaps you could just take a moment to share a bit about the context of the book. Who's it for? What's its audience? Is it for researchers? Is it for practitioners? Tell us a bit about the book.
Yeah, well, thanks, Steve, for having me, and thank you for not embarrassing me too much. That's very nice. Welcome. Yeah, so it's an interesting one, actually, as a sort of opening question, I suppose, because in some ways it's a book that has several different audiences. I mean, predominantly, of course, these books are used by students who are studying operations management. This particular one with Nigel Slack and myself, we tend to target into the postgraduate and MBA and exec space. We have another book, Operations Management, which will be the 10th edition, will be coming out next year, which we kind of target slightly more into undergraduate and master's space. So there's kind of this slight overlap between those two books in terms of their slight focus. So that's kind of one key audience, I guess, of those who want to learn about operations management, supply chain management, project management. But at the same time, I guess it is pretty heavily used by other audiences as well. So we see a lot of practitioners who continue to use this book, and actually people who reach out to me who bought the book having never been taught it by anyone else, who just like heard of it from a friend who said, oh, well, if you're trying to get your head around operations and you want something to start with, this is a really useful way to kind of give you an accurate and up-to-date and I guess eclectic view of the subject. It's not, for example, it's not too manufacturing oriented. It's quite, it's pretty diverse in its treatment of the subject. The kind of another audience, I guess, is very much into the research space. I mean, it's a tricky one really when you're writing a book like this, because in some ways, myself and Nigel Slack, who's the kind of co-author on this book, we're trying to kind of come up with our own view of the world of operations. But of course, it's quite a responsibility, because it's this and the other books are so kind of big selling around the world that you're trying to ensure that you reflect what the conversation is within the academic community, within practitioners and so forth. So every time, we're reading research articles, we're going to conferences, we're kind of taking what we think is the most useful bits of it, or the most interesting bits of it, or dare I say it, the most teachable bits of it as well, and thinking about how can we convert some of that into a language that's useful in a book like this. So there's elements of sort of literature review models. Every time we start working on a new bit of content, we'll be doing just what we would if we were doing a piece of research in a journal article. We're going and reading around the subject and then trying to consolidate it in our own words, in our own voice, if you will, for the book. And I think that's partly why you see the books as a set, have a lot of citations, because they are actually used as at the very least as a starting point for quite a lot of researchers when they're thinking about any given subject in ops, where they can go, well, let's go have a look at that chapter, and that will bring me sort of up to speed with some of the core bits. Of course, it doesn't get you into certain elements of depth that then other more pure academic papers would. So yeah, and I suppose the final sort of target is really the lecturers themselves, because we're trying to write a book that is teachable. And so we have a real mind when we're writing this of not just how it's going to be read by a student, but also how would somebody go about teaching the subject. So the structure of the chapters often relate to how myself or Nigel, how we've taught that class in a 3-hour MBA, for example. And we'll have elements of activities and so forth to really think about those things. There's a lot of extra resources that go with the book, of course. So it's not just a physical book, it's all the stuff that goes around it that sort of supports lecturers. So that's a sort of start, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck as I have these conversations with various folks about how you got into writing the book, and I was struck as I read over the weekend. I was reading through the service operations stuff, just sort of service innovation stuff as you were talking. And I'm struck by the intellectual breadth and depth of it. The synthesis of the literature you spoke about, the mini cases, the work that has to go into the engagement to make those real and persuasive and useful in the context of a narrative that you're building. It makes me want to ask, in the context of an academia that's becoming increasingly research focused, how do you, what motivates you to write and to continue to write these books in a context where, deans, people like me, are saying to you, what about your research as well as what about your teaching excellence? So can you talk a little bit about what motivates you to keep writing these fantastic books, and how you achieve some sense of balance, or what the relationship is with those other kind of academic pursuits?
Yeah, it's another really good question, actually, and I think some of it comes down to how you see these books, as in, do you see them as entirely a teaching output, or do you see them in a sense as a kind of quasi hybrid that speak to different audiences? And I think I see that as the latter. And in fact, ironically, I see it more as the latter the more I've had conversations with other people. I was chatting to a colleague recently who was sort of saying, well, this is clearly a research output. And they were very frank about it. And I said, well, I don't know if I quite see it that way. I said, well, no, definitely, because, look at the citations, look at the way it's being used, look at what, in a sense, it's not dissimilar from, aspects of systematic literature review. What's the difference? If you write in this way, it is. And I thought, Yeah, okay. In some ways, I think, again, I don't take quite that extreme view, but I do see these as research outputs as well as teaching outputs. So I think that helps. And of course, I guess not so much in management schools, but in other parts of universities, books are often used as part of the research assessments and so forth. And so I guess, ironically, when you're looking at a bigger audience, and in many senses, when these books are not just for management people, they're actually used by people in other kinds of spaces in universities. This has been adopted by healthcare researchers to teach operations in healthcare. They don't think about an ABS list, let's say, or journals in the same way, because they're looking at things that are slightly broader. But I think there's also a kind of, you do have to be realistic as well about what you give up to do this. I spend a lot of days in a year working on these books, and my colleague Nigel spends even more days, because he is essentially the larger of the two parties. I mean, the credit where it's due. These books originally were written by him, and over the years, going back to your question about how did you come to do it? Well, I was at Warwick as an undergraduate and became completely fascinated by operations and supply chain, and then ended up doing a PhD at Warwick. And so I kind of found myself as a junior partner on some of these editions, a number of editions back, and slowly have become more and more of a kind of a co-author and so forth. But we spend a lot of time on them. I suppose it's because deep down, I know it sounds a bit kind of cheesy, but deep down, I want to change the world for the better. And I genuinely believe that operations management done well, supply chain management done well, can make the world a better place, not just for private sector, but public sector, third sector, not just for big businesses, but for small businesses. And these books have an impact in the way that they are used, referred to, so when we think about sort of universities trying to drive impact agenda, there is no better way, in my view, than teaching and having a book that other people teach, in terms of sharing an idea of a subject, and I guess getting people really passionate. That's partly why Nigel and I spend a lot of time coming up with new case boxes, new examples, new little bits of content all the time. It's partly, I think, why I got very frustrated reading a ranking thing. There was a little note in it that was talking about these kind of power rankings, and said, well, some of these books are in their 10th edition, with the implication that they were therefore out of date. It's like, well, there are 10th editions and 10th editions. There are those that have just never been challenged, but there are those where we've had lots of other really great operations textbooks that have come into the market, that are also really good in their own way. And that keeps us on our toes, and we do a lot of change in each edition. And so it gets me excited. Another point, and I'm aware that I'm sort of waffling a little bit here, is that whenever we do a piece of work, whether it's a pure piece of research, whether it's a pure piece of teaching, I try a lot to think about how can I get a lot of hits for my money in terms of time. So within this book, there'll be pieces of pure research that I'm working on. So I'm doing some stuff on sort of agency-based relationships, principal-agent relationships, and looking at challenging theories of that with some colleagues, Eric van Rij at Rotterdam, and Katri Kauppi and Juri Matanaiki from Aalto in Finland. So that's a kind of piece of, if I dare say it, pure research, aiming at the kind of journals that a dean would be happy with, that an associate dean for research would be happy with. But there are parts of it which then have found themselves into this textbook in a simplified, reduced format that talk to managing supplier relationships on multiple levels. And it's perhaps a single little figure and a little 3 paragraphs, maybe 2 paragraphs even. And all the way through it, there are bits of that where it's either my own research or colleagues' research. A case study, then one of the new case studies was with Jens Rurik and Jazz Kara and Brian Squire, where we brought them in to work on a co-produced case study that pretty much is based on the Hinkley Point C research project, and it's all around sort of supplier development in the local region and everything else. And we've written it as a teaching case study, but it couldn't have been written without the research. So those are examples, I guess, where we're kind of drawing on other activities. But yeah, it is a lot of work, to be fair.
But also a lot of impact, right? I mean, I'm struck by the comments you make around impact. It seems to me that we underplay in some ways when we come to ref and other things, the knowledge transfer kinds of impacts that you get from writing books like yours. And perhaps that's something we need to think about.
But it's very hard to measure in a sense, I suppose, because, you know, some of these are anecdotal, you know, so you might get somebody literally 5 years out of an MBA who comes to you and says, I literally just did an inventory, and something really dull. Yeah, you know, I had a colleague. I just did an inventory analysis, and I went back to your book and worked through that diagnostic approach that you have, and I've just saved £1 million. And this is quite a small local oil petroleum business, for example. Yeah, so this is actually quite a substantial saving. But it's very hard to then write that up into some sort of impact case. It's so some of these things are hard to put metrics on, I suppose.
Do you think there's still something special about books? I mean, one thing that that motivated the event series, in a sense, was the observation that we reach different kinds of audiences in different kinds of ways. Perhaps they provide a gateway for a different kind of engagement than we would have if we just wrote 35-page papers or, you know, short newspaper stuff. You know, there's a sense in which the book provides a format for communicating ideas that is distinct from other things we do as academics. Do you think that there's still a sort of special place for that, as we, you know, as you say, on the one hand, we try, you know, not to be too obsessed in the dean's office with the kind of one way of being, if you like, but it does strike me continually just how receptive many of our publics are to the book as the kind of unit of intellectual transfer, if you like.
That's a really nice phrase, by the way. Yeah, I mean, I think so. And of course, you know, different books have different sort of targets. So if you think about some of the other books in the series, and this is in no way disrespectful, it's actually quite a compliment, is, you know, they're aimed almost like the airport books, right? You know, they're aimed at those people who are traveling, who are going to grab a book and they'll be able to read it on that flight there and home. And they have real power in trying to sort of grab an attention. So I think, you know, I think about Paul Goodwin's book that in the last one of these series, you know, that is a book that is really targeting people who maybe haven't even thought about forecasting at all, haven't even really considered the subject, and it grabs you. I mean, it's a brilliantly written book, frankly. I have a jealousy and respect in equal measure, I guess. But, you know, those are the sorts of books I think that are designed to kind of get people engaged in a subject they're not maybe thinking about. A book like this, which I guess has kind of, it's more expansive. It's you know, you couldn't just read this. Well, you could, but, you know, you probably wouldn't just read it on a quick flight. It's probably more of a book that you would sort of refer to when you run into a problem. So, you know, like you said with the innovation, as an organization, you keep feeling that, you know, you struggle to really grab on to more radical innovations, and you think, you know, let's go and have a look at that chapter that describes these sort of differences between incremental and radical innovation, and more importantly, describes some of the kind of process of innovation, the capacity and resourcing of innovation. So it's kind of quite a practical perspective on the innovation process. But then somebody else might say, well, yeah, I'm fine over there, but I'm suddenly really struggling in a COVID-19 era with Brexit to deal with my supply chain and to deal with capacity problems and demand. Let's go and have a look at those chapters and kind of draw on them. So I think I mean, I 100% feel that those kinds of audiences are not going to be reading mine or other colleagues' journal articles, frankly. At least only a very small proportion do. Yeah. Now, I think it's something we need to push for businesses, though, is that actually some of our journal articles, you know, we're getting better, I suppose, at creating, you know, managerial implication sections of papers that are meaningful. You know, it used to feel a bit like a bit of an add-on, whereas now actually editors are quite tough on that and say, look, this isn't enough. You know, you've got to do a better job in that managerial implications. You've got to do a better job in your 2-minute summary thing that you are expected to create for some of these journals. So I think journals are doing their best to try and make that translation possible, but some of the nature of these journal articles. They are impenetrable.
Yeah, they're very specific often as well, aren't they? As you say, like, you know, you can imagine the points of application to broader decisions or thinking about problems, but they get at one sliver of it rather than a broader in context view.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll be aware, Alistair, of course, of the FT teaching power ranking, and you know, I draw this to your attention. You'll be aware of it. Most rankings look at, if you like, at the pure research output. One of the things that I think is really worthy of celebration is that this latest FT ranking essentially looks at how influential academics' work is in the teaching and business and management globally. And you get Harvard at the top, and Sloan and Kellogg, and you know, other really good company are up there. Bath features 11th globally, which is very fabulous to hear. Not insubstantially because of your books, this one and the operations management book. How does that feel?
Well, it's nice for sure. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I guess it's nice to see a ranking like that attempted. Right? Now, I think we would all agree as academics that every ranking has limitations. It's a bit like, you know, once you know how sausages are made, you don't trust them as much. But then, you know, to use that analogy, of course, there are good quality sausages and less good quality sausages. So I think I'm pleased to see a ranking that, you know, reflects on that there is genuine value in having a book that's being adopted by lots and lots of universities for teaching a particular subject, whether that's, you know, mine or whether that's, you know, Andy Crane has again a book that's kind of pretty high up there in the sustainability field, for example. So there are limitations with the actual ranking in terms of, you know, when you do the digging, you go, this person has just moved, and actually, ironically, Bath was originally, I think, 13th until we reminded them that no, actually, but we've got a book, I think, by Mike Shulver that had been allocated to a previous institution, and so there's a little bit of that. But in broad terms, I was delighted, and I think it. I hope that the ranking will kind of continue to refine and become more robust, because we should in some ways be at least kind of reflecting that the total value of universities' output is not simply a function of how many journal articles. That is part of it, and it's in no way to disrespect those kind of rankings. But it's very dangerous if you start to become too narrow. Now, of course, there's a broader question, which is, do we trust any of the rankings, and would we be better to spend all of the money that's spent on rankings just doing good work and doing outreach into communities and so on? But that's a slightly different question, I guess.
It is. The Dean likes rankings.
Yeah. It's one of these. It's an irony. There was a brilliant writer, and I'm sorry if I can't remember the name, from LSE, who made this kind of point of we distrust the rankings until we do well in them, exactly. To paraphrase, and it was very nicely.
I like to think I'm slightly more willing to take the rough with the smooth than that, but I reflect on it, and I admire that ranking failings, you know, that you rightly point out with all rankings, because it does seem to me to try and access something distinctive.
Yep.
And the influence of your thought leadership, grounded in your research and your practice and your experience down the years, of that on the ways that others are teaching the subject globally, I think is a very, very material contribution to the world. So I think it's nice, really, really nice to recognise that.
I mean, it's funny because this thing about sort of the impact you have, sort of, in a sense, through the proxy of others is intriguing, because, of course, you know, when you know that maybe, you know, every year there are 25,000 of these books, give or take, being used, and then there's a pretty massive secondhand market, frankly. So it's a bit hard for Ash to know. That's partly why those teaching power rankings were quite interesting for us, because you get a clearer sense of who's adopting the book and therefore the kind of likely effect. But it does then again go back to that sense of pressure. You know, the number of times Nigel or I will get emails from people saying, you're not treating quality management as you should be, you know, and that people feel very strongly about things. So, you know, one of the questions actually in the Q&A that was raised by Melanie was around sort of, with COP26 coming to a close, what have we been, you know, how do we see ops and sustainability? And it's a really interesting question, of course, because for a number of editions in the big book, in operations management, for example, we had a separate sustainability chapter. And I was always really against it as the concept, because I always felt like it implies it's sort of like chapter 21. At the very end, you can think about sustainability. And I always felt that was really not the right way. And yet at the time, it was quite novel to have that chapter, because many chapters didn't have anything at all about sustainability. And so then it kind of maybe 2 or 3 editions back for that, and indeed for the ops and process book, we push this idea of, sustainability is absolutely everywhere. So in every single chapter, there are elements where we're driving, I guess, the sustainability agenda forward, and highlighting how, better layout in your operation in terms of things like office planning, it affects people's mental health. When you think about things like Lean and Six Sigma, well, you're basically thinking about how do you make things work better, but also how do you drive out non-value added activity and waste, which is of course good from an environmental perspective, and so on and so forth. So I think we've made a very specific point to really ensure that sustainability isn't an add-on, that it's just integral throughout. And I guess we're lucky because I have a lot of research network that's what they do. My wife Emma, is a sustainability and supply chain researcher. So in that regard, we kind of get a lot of good ideas for the book. And I think that's an important point just to kind of make. This book isn't entirely Nigel or me, frankly, and not simply because we have a case study with a colleague. That's quite a recent phenomenon where we brought people in, and Begelis, another of our really good colleagues, we wrote a case in this book. But it's more that the ideas from others are always feeding in. The number of chats I'll have with colleagues when we're doing other things, and they'll say, oh, they'll just send me a link to a cool story, and I'll go, oh, that'll make a great case. And that's partly why the acknowledgement list in the front is massive, because there's just so many people who've contributed over the editions to this and other books we do.
Mm. Yeah, I think the question about sustainability is a really powerful one. I mean, the other one that, of course, by way of kind of contemporary challenge that arises is, so what about, a post-COVID world? How's the pandemic? We talk about future of work. We talk about the impact of business on society. It's upset trade and blah, 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 blah. How do you in writing a text like this one, and like the one you're currently in the process of revising for its 10th edition, how do you deal with something so seismic as a pandemic in producing a new book?
With great difficulty. I mean, it's a brilliant question, because it was one of the hardest editions of any of the books I think we've written, because COVID-19, and to a lesser extent Brexit, and some of the trade battles between the US and China were all kind of at play, but particularly the COVID-19 kind of play right now was massive in people's minds. And yet we know that this book will be being used by a student who can't afford the 7th edition of this or the 8th edition of this in 6 years' time, because they go and buy a secondhand book. And we don't want to kind of, so we have this really tricky balancing act whenever we're writing of how do we keep it nice and fresh and relevant, but not to the point where it ages really, really quickly. Because in 3 years' time, if all the news case boxes were all about COVID-19, people are going, oh God, that's a bit dated. But then if we just ignore it, people will say, well, hang on a minute, this is one of the most seismic events of the last 30 years. Why haven't you covered it? So we did have, various specific COVID-19 case boxes are, of course, are a good way of dealing with that, because you can talk about topic knowledge, which is longer, if you will, but then case boxes that can, we pretty much change over a third of all the case boxes every single edition, so they can be very kind of in the moment. But one of the tricky ones was the unknowable effect of COVID-19 on things like supply chain design and structure. There's anticipation work that you're having to write in and decide. You have to jump one way or another. So, for example, do we have a whole section on reshoring? for example, and
Yeah.
bringing suppliers back to more domestic space. Well, we've always actually had a small section on that anyway in the sourcing configuration part of the book. So what you can do there is to just say, for example, these kinds of events, and then you can maybe point to some other events actually across a longer time frame, often result in a rapid reshoring followed actually by a gentle offshoring. As you know, so actually you can speak about the idea that COVID-19 is not a specific event in that regard. It is a kind of peak point that drives people in a certain way and then kind of loosens back up. Similarly, you know, you could talk about what's the effect on, you know, the physical working environment. I think that's a much trickier one, because that could be a fundamental, not change that drifts back, but actually just a fundamental change. And so we've talked there around some of the ways in which, you know, working from home, flexible working from an operations perspective is really interesting, from managing capacity, flexing capacity, but there are also challenges of making that work. And COVID-19 has simply accelerated that process and therefore needs more thought. So yeah, it's been a real challenge, to be honest, but a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, that if you like is that and sustainability you might see as the big, you know, I'll say external to the organization kind of phenomenon, if you like. What are the big things you see in the context of the discipline, if you like, of operations and supply chain management? You know, what's come along there since the last edition that you think is really important, that is more prominent in the mix perhaps than it was before?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's some that are kind of gentle trends. So I think, for example, you know, if you ask somebody, and I sometimes do this as the first thing I do in teaching, I'll say, you know, I say operations management, you say, you know, it's kind of, because most of the time you'll still get reactions of like manufacturing, cars, aerospace, big, high volume, you know, people go to that factory mode in their mind often. And I think that mindset is just continuing to shift, because of course that is 100% operations. And some people often will ask, like, you know, why did Nigel originally write these books? It was basically to challenge that preconception. And I think the book and the kind of examples we give really push this idea of operations is everywhere. It is for everyone. It is service, it is manufacturing, it is professional services as well as high volume. It is the project world, it is the you know, small businesses, it's public sector, it's third sector. So it's everywhere in the world. It's not just in developed countries, and so on and so forth. So I think what we have seen in the last kind of couple of editions is really being able to bring in the knowledge from academia on how the models evolve when you're, for example, applying them in professional services. So as you'll know, like Mike Lewis does some amazing work on professional services, and I've been lucky enough to work with him on various bits. But there's also quite a lot now in, you know, Journal of Operations Management and kind of high-end journals around professional service operation settings. And so you can be reading that and actually thinking, oh, that really works. I'm going to take that into the book. And so the book has more, I guess, less shouting that you need to think about this, and actually more examples of frameworks and thoughts that have come out of academia, if you will, around professional services. The second one, the biggest one, I guess, though, which has kind of gone much more like that, has been around AI and you know, disruptive technologies. That we have, this book had a very big push on really being kind of up to date on various bits of technology. Not that you ever can be, of course, because they just move so fast. And again, it's tricky because you can have a new technology that you think we better write about it, and then it turns out that's one that just collapses in a heap. So how do you write about blockchain when the dynamics of blockchain are so tricky, essentially? So you kind of often, yeah, again, torn between how contemporary to be, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think the sense of wanting to pull people from sort of the Ford Model T into the contemporary kind of organizational kind of life and say, look, you know, we've got a lot of service sector organizations. There are huge operations problems there. You know, one thing I reflect on is how prominent operations and service management is now in our sector. And I sort of wonder, so, slight gambit of a question, without notice, but, what would you say, given your experience over the last kind of 20 years or so of in a sense, the case has been won, I think. I see the university set up a strategic projects office and so on and so forth. What do you think, a leader in higher education could get from reading your book?
Yeah, thanks for that. So, I mean, I think the case has been somewhat won. I agree. And again, just to answer slightly, if I think about when I used to go into things like hospitals 20 years ago to do ops and process bits of consulting work very early on in my career, the reaction could be extremely negative. Like, we are not a factory, and actually that you generally don't find that. You do still find some people who have a certain view, but it's quite a small minority. Actually, most people appreciate that, they are running processes. Essentially, you're dealing with inputs of information, of people, of materials, or some combination, and you need to think about how do you organize them effectively. I think the other thing that's been really pleasing, if you will, is that sense that people are increasingly aware that it's not just about cutting costs. I think that's been a kind of a frustrating preconception. It's actually just about doing whatever you want to do better. So if you're all about being ultra flexible, how can you make an operation and a supply chain deliver against that objective? If you're trying to be super fast, how do you design accordingly? So to go to then your specific question of what would I say someone could gain from a book like this, I think it allows you to kind of start at the beginning in terms of, our first chapters are all about what is operations fundamentally trying to do and how does it link to your overall strategy. And so rather than simply copying this other university that are doing things in a certain way, it's saying, what are you ultimately trying to compete on? How is your strategy set up? And then how do you design and improve and organize your operations, your processes, your suppliers, in order to deliver against that? And that idea of alignment, I think, would be really important, because sometimes within the higher education sector, and dare I say it, within an awful lot of organizations, there's the sense of copying others without thinking it through is a very dangerous thing. And then you'll get people saying, we tried that, it failed. It didn't fail because the tool was wrong. It's failed because you basically took a saw when you needed a hammer, or whatever it might be. So that would be my key one. I think it would help people really understand the context in which you apply this idea. I've heard people talking about, everyone's talking about 0 hours contracts, gig economy, right? And there's some really interesting ethical debates around that, but there are also operational debates around the benefits of that, because if you have only adjunct professors, for example, you lose your knowledge, you lose that kind of core. But if you only have people who are on fixed 5-day-a-week contracts, you have no flexibility. So actually the truth is some hybrid is an effective capacity model, and it's thinking through what are the contexts of my particular setting that would determine the mix of full-time, part-time, contracted, adjunct, etc. So I suppose it's sort of building a richer view of what operations can do for you, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, I think about accreditation, I think about continuous improvement and the resonance with much of what's been said in operations for 15 or 20 years. I think about lean, I think about flexibility and agility and so on. I think there is so much in this post-pandemic world, if you like, because I think there's a lot of modernization and professionalization in a certain sense that's happening in the sector. I can't help feeling that the tools of operations management are really, really powerful in that context.
Yeah, and one other little thing that's worth saying is, as a kind of hint for those who are practitioners on this call, is often it is a lot easier to play with other people's problems first before you try and apply them to your own. So we've got cases here, like this one I mentioned with Vigelis Giannakis, where we wrote something called Fresh Lunch. It's a capacity case, basically, around sort of a restaurant and dealing with demand spikes in the middle of the day and customers getting annoyed in queues, layout problems. So it's a classic kind of operations case. Simple enough, for people to get their head around quite quickly, but got enough richness for you to get really quite into it and get into the data if you want, and play with some simple forecasting models. But if you don't want to, you could just visualize it. But the point there is, when you take that to an executive audience, and often, you're running these with exec MBAs or in organizations where they're running kind of training for their middle and senior managers, they completely can get all the problems because it's somebody else's problem. And they can go, oh my goodness, how can they be so stupid having a process that runs like that? And so you kind of do all the learning by playing with a case. And then you say, right, now let's have a look at your own organization, your own operation. And of course, many of the problems of they haven't really looked at the demand patterns through the year. They've just got a bit of a sense of it, but they haven't really done their analysis, become more powerful. So if you're trying to drive operations improvement in an organization, it's so helpful to do it with other people's problems first. So people get comfortable with the tools and then tackle, because there's a lot of resistance otherwise, understandably, because you're trying to essentially say, we've been doing it all wrong for the last ever.
Yeah, I mean, I like the invocation to use other people's problems as a sort of context within which to develop skills and insights, because it's just so much less personal. I'll ask. I'm grateful to colleagues who've already posed some questions. I'll ask the first of them in a moment, but just to give that heads up that, in 15 minutes time, we're going to have 15 questions and you're not going to get answers to them. So if you're keen to pose a question to Alistair, do so now, please. I'll start with a version of Mike's question. So, Mike asks a question about, how does the writing of really any of the 3 or 4 books that you are constantly working on, how does that translate into the digital world, if you like? And I'll extend that to say, post-COVID, there's a lot of innovation in teaching and learning. The strong form of the question would be, what is the role of the textbook in that digital future? Now, in part, I'm assuming you'll say I'm misunderstanding what a textbook is, in a sense, in the contemporary era. But I guess giving you an invitation to sort of say, what is the play? In 15 years, will you be not writing these anymore? What will the world look like then? So how do texts respond to and fit in with that more digital education future?
Yeah, good question. Now, I guess I've always been, partly because of my research being on, so much of it on digitalized operations and supply chain, I've always kind of been extremely in favor of the use of technology to support operations generally. And so the book's no different. So actually this book, the 6th edition, I think it was the 3rd edition of that book. We were the first management book to kind of have a simple, at the time, online version of it, right? And that had, you could click a little link and it would show you the figure being animated, and you could click another link and it would show Nigel or me as little us on a slide going, hello, this is a demand pattern, and what you can see here, and it was probably, you look back at it now and you go, oh my goodness, this is really naff, but for its time it was quite innovative. It was like over 10 years ago, and ironically, I remember at the time Pearson saying, this will probably be the last time we do a physical book, because it's gonna go all online. And of course, we haven't got to that point yet. Now, I don't think, just because when you look back, I think the changes are happening much faster now. So you can see a lot of libraries at universities who are not actually buying the physical book, they're buying access to an e-version of it, and the e-version is really great because it, to sort of Nigel's point, it allows you a lot more in terms of that linking ability. You can have links across to the actual core story that you built your case study on. You can have the links that take you to the Forbes article on which some of that was originated from. You can have a link here, say, want to know more. So you've got these kind of slightly more heavy duty critical commentaries that at the moment we've written into the book, kind of critical commentaries that challenge essentially some perspective of that chapter. You could have a lot more of that could link you to more academic literature, for example. We've got a load of online materials already. We have something called the MyOM Lab, which has 5 or 6 simulations. It has tons of algorithmically generated MCQs and exercises, and so there's a huge amount sort of beyond the physical book that's already there. But I think that's only going to carry on further. So I know Pearson have been working on a product called Revel, which is kind of aimed at deconstructing these books into essentially A heads. So within a single chapter, you've probably got like 5 sections, 5 A heads. And so you could imagine each of those being a bite-sized kind of piece of content that can be linked across from a lecturer who's teaching something, and they can teach it in a sense in their own way, rather than saying, I expect you to read chapter 11 for this particular lecture. It's no, I expect you to link to the following 5 dots that maybe sit normally in different parts of the book because they connect. So if you're COVID-19, you might be reading a couple of bits on supply chain structure and a bit over here on supply chain management and a bit on project management because there's a whole thing on, dealing with, COVID-19, and there's a nice case in the project book on vaccines, for example. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to produce more customized for the lecturer material. Now, again, it's ironic because it's always been there. Technically, there are a few lecturers around the world who go to Pearson and say, I would like 6 chapters of Slack et al. I'd like 2 chapters of Brammer's book. I'd like a couple of chapters of Andy Crane because I'm going to push on sustainability more. And actually, I'd like, and they can do that. And then they have a little thing saying, customized, and that's the name of the title, and it's all bound and everything else, but it's not that popular. I think going into a kind of more e-domain, things like that are going to become much more popular. So to answer your question, might it be the end of our books? I think in the current kind of the visual format, quite possibly there'll be a time where we don't produce the physical book. But the question of, will there still be a role for people to essentially consolidate huge amounts of content perspectives on a topic and put it into a way that's usable for practitioners or for new lecturers or for students who are self-learning? I still think there'll be a role there to essentially do that piece of work. So I suppose I hope there'll still be a role because I'm it's part of me, it's a real passion to keep on, I guess, driving the discipline forward in a way that I believe in, and kind of, I guess, pushing back at aspects of the discipline that I don't, frankly.
I think it's right, isn't it? It's a sort of Netflix world, isn't it? Like the intellectual property's still got to be there, but how it is bundled and rebundled and purchased and accessed by potential users, either, as you say, on the teaching side or as students of various different kinds of the discipline. I mean, I was struck, I'm going to pick up Jazz's question in the chat. I was struck by what you just said and what you said at the outset, in a sense, about, in undertaking these books, you're trying to do a sort of on the one hand, to be faithful to the evolution of the discipline. In another sense, you're sort of imposing a worldview on that and organizing that discipline and set of fields in order that people can make sense of it in sensible ways and so on. And Jazz asked the question really about kind of what isn't ops management, because when you develop that kind of worldview oriented kind of approach, I think it does beg a question about what's in and out, where and how in undertaking this kind of work do you draw those boundaries? Because these are all of them. I mean, I thank you for giving me them all, Al. But they are massive pieces of work, right? These are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of incredibly detailed, thoughtful work. How do you make a decision about something that's in or out on the basis of how well it fits with a worldview or a sense of what operations management is?
Yeah, good question. So I think firstly, we talk to a lot of colleagues when we're bouncing ideas about what sort of should be in, what should be given more airtime. And so part of, I guess that's why, I mean, and I didn't mean it kind of to be just polite to people. I really mean that it is a kind of collective. There's a lot of people out there who kind of feel it's sort of there, but they've got shares in it. Now, it might be that we're the majority shareholders, but they've got shares in this book and they feel quite strongly about how it evolves. And sometimes that can be problematic. Because sometimes you say, you know what, look, this particular chapter is just not being taught. And again, if you go right back to one of the core things is which bits are being most commonly used or not used, that does drive our thinking. And so there might be chapters in the past. We had a chapter in the past that was a whole chapter on layout, for example, because once upon a time that was a bigger sort of subject in terms of teaching, and now it's kind of incorporated within one of the other chapters around sort of process design, for example. So in that sense, you're always going to upset some people as you shift across. Recently, for example, there was we had a live debate about should we get rid of the lean chapter. Now you can imagine that could create havoc, because a lot of people teach lean as a single session, and they've been teaching it like that for a long time, and yet arguably many of the aspects of lean have now sort of just become sort of morphed into operations management generally. Now we've kind of stuck with holding a separate lean chapter, but you can see these are difficult decisions to make. Similarly, for example, how much do we extend into supply chain management and project management has been really tricky, because these are subjects which I personally view operations management as an umbrella that incorporates both the project aspects of operations, i.e. the kind of very low volume, high variety space, in simple terms, the extended network view of supply chain alongside sort of traditional operations, if you will. There are others who say, no, project management is an entirely separate subject, and you shouldn't even have a chapter on it. It's an insult to have a chapter on project management because you can't give it the depth it needs. So I guess some of that becomes the practical point, which is, one, I believe project management is part of operations, so I'm putting it in, and Nigel and I believe that. Two, because we know that there are lots of people when they teach operations where they do a session on project management to get people excited enough to want to do the elective on project management. So, but what there isn't any point, and what actually I wanted to have 2 chapters on project management this time because I've been doing a lot on it recently. Actually, we thought, well, there isn't really any point because in truth, the people who teach it as an elective don't use this book. They might use this as one of the reference books, but then they have a project management textbook that they use. And if you're a project management practitioner specializing in it, you'll be buying project management books, but you might still find this chapter actually quite useful as a kind of, here's the person who's just starting to think about projects, just go and have a look at that chapter, and that will give you a good grounding that's quite up to date. It's gone quite a lot of behavioral angles around stakeholders and everything else. So it's a long answer to your question, but we constantly are being lobbied, frankly, by people who want more of their thing and less of somebody else's. And of course, you kind of gently tread that. You can't change everything in one edition either, because of course there is a continuity factor. There is the fact that some students are using one edition or an edition older, so if it completely changes, it can become problematic to teach. But you can't be held back by the previous edition. So I'm quite often keen to completely change chapters and structures, and I kind of think, well, it works better this way, and we shouldn't be worrying about, we can take people with us, and we have a lot of, people have a lot of trust in the brand, in a sense, the Slack brand, frankly, but hopefully now the Slack and Brandon-Jones brand, they have faith in that because it's been around for a long time and it's seen them through.
Yeah, so a question I don't understand, but I'll pose it to you anyway. So a non-methodological joyer in the chat has asked, could you say structure modularity is a feature built towards a better UX?
Yeah,
I put that to you as someone who will understand that.
Yeah, so I think if you think about user experience of the book, and so yes, essentially to Joya's question, I would say that we do think about the idea of it is a book that is non-linear for most readers. So it's not like I mean, some people do literally start on chapter 1 and they have their lectures all laid out, or they're practitioners and they go, right, well, where do I start? I start at chapter 1, I work my way through. But in truth, most people are using the order in their own way for their own courses, or, as I said, if you're a practitioner, they're using it because they've suddenly run into X problem and they go straight to that chapter, or straight to that section. And so when we've designed both the macro structure of the book and indeed within any individual chapter, we try to work on the basis that each element kind of is a standalone feature that could be read just as it is. And we'll often just test that by just randomly going to a section that I've written or that Nigel has written, and we'll kind of read it and just go, did it make sense in of itself? But then, you know, we're almost like, it's a suggested route, but it's not the only route. So it's a bit like your IKEA routing, right? There is a normal way that people perhaps typically follow, and that's why, you know, risk is often towards the back end, because that's often how that gets covered later on in many lecture series, for example. And there is a logic of having, you know, what's his operations all about, an operations strategy right at the start. But, you know, some people don't do that because they've done lots of strategy somewhere else, and they say, it's too repetitive, because maybe they've had quite an operations oriented strategy lecturer who covered a lot of that stuff. And so you get straight into process design, let's say, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Well, Paul asks a version of the pandemic question. So, of course, he was one of our wonderful MBA students in the last cohort, had a pandemic-affected experience. I think, you know, would have seen, as you have, the kind of innovations in teaching and learning that have come along in that era. And I guess the question is about, you know, what do you do differently, and then what do you need to do as a leading author differently to support those new pedagogies?
Yeah, good question. So I think in some way, I think the content, this isn't so much of a content issue, because in many respects, what we've got here are, you know, making decisions about what content we do or don't include. This is more about then how do we imagine it being taught. So when we're I guess writing, one of the things we've done with recent books particularly is we've added more in the way of worked examples within the text itself, because it helps people kind of get their head around how a tool could be applied. So we kind of have thought a bit, well, we've always tried to think about the kind of the student and the lecturer when we're writing the book, about how it's presented. I think where we'll see more is actually things like in the instructor's manual, because in the instructor's manual, we will have in our mind that some people will be teaching this in a traditional face-to-face. So we'll give an example of a little exercise that works really well for you know, demonstrating processes, for example. But we will also say, and if you're teaching this online, you could do it in the following way. And sometimes it's like, you know, we often see online as the kind of lesser option, right? And I guess I'd push back at that in some respects. And I am passionate about face-to-face teaching. I love experiential teaching. I do a lot of, you know, activity-based learning. So some of that is hard to replicate. But there are elements online that can be really powerful. So, you know, the democratization of the classroom, I think you sometimes see more of that because of this sort of the anonymity almost can help people feel more comfortable just to post stuff, and you get a lot more shared learning. So, you know, you'll often see in a live session people posting a question, other people answering it and clarifying it, and then you'll see if there's a real energy around a particular query or whatever. So I think, you know, some of it's just about giving people ideas for how to teach it if they're doing it online. I had a fun one, for example, where inventory management, you know, it's a dry subject, right? You know, you've got to be really keen on ops to be excited by inventory management. And okay, we talk a bit about inventories of information, inventories of people, inventories of materials, so you can start to challenge people's preconceptions about what inventory even is. But then when we had all this home learning, you could get people to basically do like a little inventory analysis at home in their kitchen live, you know. So you say like, right, you've got 20 minutes to go downstairs and basically check your stock cupboards and roughly estimate how much money you've got sitting in there, how many things are out of date. Everybody has to bring one item back to the screen of an out of date item. And it worked brilliantly because everyone was like, the amounts were huge. And then of course you can roll a sort of like, let's imagine if we invested a part of this saved inventory in a nice, simple trust fund until you're retired. How old are you? And well, bloody hell, that's going to cover you a holiday to the Maldives. But the point there was you couldn't do this in a class, physical class, because they had to be at home. So I think it's about being creative on how can you do things where you can only do it online. It works better because it's online. And so sharing some of those ideas as well.
Well, thank you. I think our time is up, but that is an extremely optimistic and I think really accurate as well kind of place for us to finish for the morning. So it remains for me to thank you, Alistair. Thank you for
Thanks, Steve.
sharing your experience and wisdom of writing these incredibly successful books. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you everybody for attending. There'll be a link of our conversation so that if you wanted to view it again or share it with colleagues, the recording will be made available afterwards. And I look forward to welcoming you all down the track at our next Dean's Book Series event. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of day. Al, thank you once again.
Thank you. And thank you obviously to Nigel Slack, particularly because of course he is a huge part of the success of these books. And as we go forward for the 10th edition, we will be having a new co-author as well, who will be Nicola Burgess. So she'll be joining the author team for the 10th edition. So that's very exciting as well. So a plug.
Fabulous.
Thank you, Steve, for your time, and everyone.